Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Appalachian history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. Dr. Lysander Hargrave arrived in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, in the fall of 1963, with just surveying tools and a research grant obtained from the Society for National Speleology. His mission seemed simple: record the uncharted cave networks beneath the Seneca Rocks, a massive limestone deposit that has long piqued the interest of geologists. What started off as ordinary geological fieldwork would develop into something much more intricate, leaving a legacy of unsolved problems. According to the Smithsonian Institution's official archives, Dr. Hargrave was an expert in subterranean water systems and karst terrain. Co-workers characterized him as methodical, almost obsessive, and known for spending weeks by himself in isolated places. He had previously traveled through the caves of Kentucky and Tennessee, where his meticulous maps had been extremely helpful to search and rescue teams as well as scholarly societies. According to all accounts, the solitude and technical difficulties that Appalachian cave systems posed made him the ideal kind of researcher. The residents of Riverton, the closest community to his. Dr. Hargrave was first perceived as having a typical mountain reserve at the research site. Based on St. Matthew's Episcopal Church parish records, he occasionally attended services, but he didn't try to interact with longer residents. Later, county officials were informed by Mrs. Cordelia Fenwick, who ran the town's lone boarding house, that the doctor had regular hours and didn't talk much at meals. He paid his weekly rent exactly, according to her handwritten ledger, which was found years later in the county courtroom basement. On schedule and never asked for extra help. The first clue that Dr. Hargrave's research had taken an unexpected turn can be found in a letter he wrote to his department chair at George Washington University on October 15, 1963. Discovering structural irregularities in what the locals referred to as Whispering Hollow Cave that are at odds with natural formation patterns is mentioned in the letter kept in university archives. Although he used precise technical jargon, co-workers who read the letter. Decades later, it was observed that his appeal for more time and money was unusually urgent. The Pocahontas Times, a local weekly newspaper, reported that the highlands saw very harsh weather in October 1963. Temperatures plummeted below freezing for 3 weeks in a row, and early snow arrived before the leaves had completely turned. In fields next to the forest where Dr. Hargrave performed his investigation, local farmers reported that their livestock were acting strangely and would not graze. There were a few brief references to these agricultural issues in newspaper archives that are microfilmed at the West Virginia State Library, but no link was made to the continuing scientific research. An record from November 2, 1963, in Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house ledger, states that Dr. Hargrave had not returned for supper, as was customary. His research materials were still in his room, according to the note in her meticulous calligraphy, indicating that he had not planned to be gone for a long time. When he showed up the next morning, Mrs. Fenwick noted that he ate an exceptionally substantial breakfast, but remained silent. According to her notation, there were indications of extended exposure to cold and moisture on his clothing. A sequence of telegrams that Dr. Hargrave sent to several academic institutions in November 1963 shed light on the nature of his discovery within Whispering Hollow Cave. These exchanges, which have been saved in the records of 3 distinct colleges, demonstrate his developing belief that the evidence of centuries-old human modification was found in the cave system. He described worked stone surfaces and what he called intentional architectural interventions in the deepest accessible rooms in his more detailed letters. On November 18, 1963, a particularly illuminating telegraph was sent to the American Anthropological Association, asking for details regarding the area's historical patterns of settlement. In particular, Dr. Hargrave asked if there were any religious towns or remote tribes that may have utilized caverns for ceremonial or sheltering purposes. The association's response about Dr. Hargrave's personal belongings offered scant details, but recommended that he seek out more in-depth regional history by contacting local historical societies and church documents. During this time, Dr. Hargrave started interacting with the elderly people who lived in the nearby valleys. Handwritten notes found much later in his study materials indicate that he spoke with a number of family have several generations of roots in the region. These discussions, which took place in the parlors of remote farmhouses and around wood fires and rural shops, uncovered a long-standing custom in the area to stay away from Whispering Deep Cave, especially in the winter. The most thorough explanation of local belief about the cave was given to Dr. Hargrave by Ephraim Dulemer, an elderly man whose family had resided in the same valley since before the Civil War. As stated in Dr. Hargrave's notes, meticulous handwriting that is enigmatic. Between the first snowfall and the spring thaw, Dulemer explained, his grandfather had cautioned against going into the cave system. The warning itself had been passed down as strongly as any religious dogma, but the precise justification for this prohibition had been lost over the years. Similar avoidance habits were seen in several households, according to additional interviews recorded in Dr. Hargrave's field notes. The farmstead next to the cave opening, Thessaly Millwood, informed the researcher that her family had never allowed their animals to graze in the cave's opening hole. When asked for details, all she could say was that animals would not stay peaceful in that place, and that her mother had insisted the grass there never grew properly. During this time, Dr. Hargrave's research approach shows his increasing disengagement from geological issues. His journals, which were written in an exacting hand that grew notably less stable as November went on, record his choice to stay for a long time inside the cave system. Originally designed to track changes in temperature and humidity, these overnight visits progressively grew from one night to 3 or 4 days at a time. Dr. Hargrave's final correspondence with his university was a brief telegram dated December 3, 1963. The note that was kept in department archives only said that he had discovered important cultural artifacts that needed to be conserved right away. He asked for more money for what he called emergency documentation processes and a prolongation of his leave. No further information was included in the telegraph, and university representatives' later attempts to get in touch with Dr. Hargrave were unsuccessful. The December 1963 ledger entries made by Mrs. Fenwick depict growing anxiety in the small town of Riverton. Although Dr. Hargrave still visited the boarding house occasionally, his conduct had drastically changed. She observed that he frequently showed up for meals. Occasions, dressed in the same clothes he had worn days before, and that instead of eating in the communal dining room, he had started asking for his food to be wrapped so he could take it with him. Mrs. Fenwick's comments regarding Dr. Hargrave's physical state during these fleeting encounters were even more unsettling. According to her meticulous notes, the man had lost a significant amount of weight. His hands were covered in wounds and scrapes, and he appeared incapable of staying motionless for more than a short while at a time. Even though he hadn't been in the building for 3 days, she videotaped him asking her multiple times in an hour whether she had heard any strange noises emanating from his room. Geological surveys years later revealed that even seasoned spelunkers faced several difficulties in the cave system itself. Whispering Hollow Cave, which stretched almost 2 miles into the mountain, included several chambers connected by passageways that varied in size from passageways to cramped crawlways that are not large enough for one person. The cave's name came from its acoustic qualities, which made even small noises reverberate and spread throughout the system, giving the impression of faraway conversations to early visitors. Dr. Hargrave's interest in these auditory occurrences is evident in his field notes from this time. He recorded how the cave's natural sounds were warped and how his own footsteps seemed to go on forever after he had stopped. Moving, and how what he first thought were aural illusions were actually caused by the air moving through the channels. His subsequent entries, however, point to a developing conviction that these sounds followed patterns too regular to be coincidental. Thessaly Millwood reported seeing lights moving inside Whispering Hollow Cave for 3 nights in a row to the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department on December 15, 1963. The sheriff's report, which was recorded in the county, states that these lights, according to Millwood, came and went in patterns that were too consistent to be the product of routine cave investigation. The next day, deputies conducted an investigation and discovered indications of recent human presence, but they were unable to locate Dr. Hargrave or his equipment. Dr. Hargrave had been using a location deep within the cave system as a semi-permanent research station, according to the sheriff's inquiry. Deputies found surveying supplies, study materials, and camping equipment. Instruments set up in what they called an unnaturally ordered fashion. The most disturbing, according to the official investigation, was the finding of Dr. Hargrave's notebooks, which recorded his activity until the day before, but included incomplete observations and progressively illegible handwriting. Deputies discovered comprehensive maps of the cave system that went well beyond any known passageways among Dr. Hargrave's research papers. These charts were hand-drawn and showed chambers and tying together tunnels that would take weeks to discover. However, Dr. Hargrave had only been in the region for 3 months and had been working alone. Additionally, none of the investigating officers were able to decipher the notations on the maps, which seemed to be written in a combination of geological terms and symbols. Dr. Hargrave's last notebook entries, which completely deviated from his previously clinical documentation manner, were even more perplexing. These last pages were composed in an increasingly unpredictable. Temperature fluctuations were seen in handwriting, but there was no discernible pattern. He frequently mentioned structural changes that he maintained could not be the product of typical geological processes, as well as descriptions of air currents that appear to run against natural slopes. When Dr. Hargrave did not show up for a scheduled interview on December 22, 1963, the sheriff's inquiry came to an end. His equipment was still there when his study site was searched. However, his lights, rope, and the notebooks holding his most recent observations were all vanished. Although there were indications that the cave entrance had been used recently, deputies were hesitant to carry out a thorough underground search without the necessary tools and staff. Mrs. Fenwick reported on Christmas Eve, 1963, that Dr. Hargrave had spent the night again at the boarding home and taken his personal effects. It wasn't until she saw that his room had been exactly as he had left it that she realized this. Stripped of any personal belongings and clothing, his research materials and scientific equipment, however, were left intact. Most astonishingly, Mrs. Fenwick maintained that she had not heard any noises during the night, and that there were no indications of forced entry on the windows or doors of the house. The finding of a brief message placed in Dr. Hargrave's room by Mrs. Fenwick is documented in a final entry in her ledger dated December 25, 1963. The statement, which was written in his characteristic handwriting on university letterhead, said simply, "There was no signature on the message, which said, 'Research complete. Findings require different preservation methods do not follow.'" There was no further information concerning Dr. Hargrave's whereabouts or plans. When local authorities were informed by George Washington University in January 1964 The disappearance of Dr. Lysander Hargrave became the subject of an official investigation. The researcher's failure to return from his authorized leave and his failure to reply to several telegrams alarmed university administrators, asking for updates on his development. The ensuing inquiry showed how far Dr. Hargrave had strayed from his initial plan for the study, but it offered no further insight on his whereabouts. When the National Speleological Society asked for access to Dr. Hargrave's study papers and cave maps, the federal government became involved in the dispute. In March 1964, a group of seasoned cavers and geological experts thoroughly investigated Whispering Hollow Cave. Reports detailing their results, submitted to several government organizations, attested to the cave system's far greater extent than previously thought. However, they were unable to locate Dr. Hargrave or his misplaced equipment. Nonetheless, evidence supporting some of Dr. Hargrave's more outlandish statements was found by the FBI inquiry team. They recorded locations deep within the cave system where human activity had obviously altered natural rock formations. These changes, which mostly included smoothed root walls and engraved handholds, appeared to have been used recently, although being rather old. Most importantly, the scientists discovered unmistakable evidence that someone had been residing in the deepest accessible chambers for an extended period of time. Several notebooks with observations in Dr. Hargrave's characteristic handwriting were among the artifacts found in these subterranean chambers. According to these last records, he had lived subterranean for a long time, subsisting on supplies found throughout the cave system and only coming to the surface when, briefly, in order to obtain more resources. During this time, he was fixated on what he called architectural evidence of intentional environmental modification. In his last writings, Dr. Hargrave expressed his increasing belief that Whispering Hollow Cave had been deliberately altered over decades, or even centuries, to provide permanent refuge for those who desired total seclusion from the outside world. He recorded signs of rudimentary dwellings carved into the rock, wasting, disposal systems that directed sewage down, as well as what seemed to be intentional sound-canceling changes that would enable residents to pass through the cave system undetected. Dr. Hargrave's conclusions that there was unmistakable proof the cave had been inhabited recently, possibly within months of his own arrival, were the most unsettling. According to his notes, he found personal belongings, bedding materials, and food supplies that indicated the system had been used as shelter by several people. But he never met these occupants face to face, and he deduced that they had retreated farther into uncharted territory of the cavern when they realized he was there. In June 1964, the government investigation came to an official end with a report that accepted Dr. Hargrave's absence as unexplained, but speculated that he had probably become lost in the intricate cave system and died from exposure or an accident. Although this finding met bureaucratic criteria, it did not address the many discrepancies in the data or provide an explanation for why a seasoned speleologist would forsake his tools and carry on exploring by himself in hazardous circumstances. Locals continued to believe that the official answer was insufficient. During 1964 and 1965, other people claimed to have seen lights moving in Whispering Hollow Cave in the winter, always in the same pattern that Thessaly Millwood had initially noticed. These county officials' reports detailed lights that seemed to travel along certain paths and at a steady pace throughout the cave system, indicating intentional human involvement as opposed to natural occurrences. A group of local guys made an attempt to investigate the cave system on their own in the spring of 1965. Ephraim Dulamer, whose family had been in the region for many generations, was in charge. After exploring the top chambers of Whispering Hollow Cave, an unofficial search team withdrew when they found obvious signs of recent living in locations that the It had been described as uninhabited by federal investigators. They reported to the sheriff's office that they discovered recently used camping gear and food supplies that weren't there during the official search conducted the year before. Another concerning fact was uncovered by the locals' unofficial probe. Deep in the cave, Dr. Hargrave's research station seemed to have been kept up and enlarged since his departure. Equipment that was taken out during the federal investigation had been swapped out for comparable things, and there were indications of continuous use in the living area. Most importantly, the detectives discovered further notebooks with entries in Dr. Hargrave's characteristic handwriting that were dated months after his official disappearance. These subsequent diaries, which were not given to the government, recorded Dr. Hargrave's ongoing investigation into what he had started to characterize as an intentional society of withdrawal. According to his entries, he had gotten in touch with people who had been using the cave system as a long-term haven from the outside world, and he was progressively welcomed into their remote community. His writing at this time revealed his developing understanding of what he called total environmental independence, rather than any indications of discomfort or coercion. The most recent passages in these unofficial notebooks, which date to early 1965, discuss Dr. Hargrave's choice to completely give up his previous life and dedicate himself to the studies he referred to as real. He wrote of throwing away his old identity, trashing his university degrees, and adopting what he called the only sincere reaction to needless civilization. These last notes implied that he saw his departure as a necessary release from responsibilities that had kept him from seeking true enlightenment, rather than as a loss. The finding of these extra items put local authorities in a precarious position. It seems that Dr. Hargrave made the decision to go missing. However, he had neglected his legal and professional responsibilities without giving formal notice. There were obviously people living outside of the established social institutions in the cave system, but they seemed harmless and deliberately avoided interaction with the outer world. In a scenario that had attained a stable equilibrium, official action appeared to be both unfeasible and potentially disruptive. It was decided to lock Whispering Hollow's main entrance, post cautionary signs that forbid unauthorized access to the cave. This decision, made in late 1965, acknowledged that the cave system could be dangerous for novice explorers and ultimately put a stop to official interest in Dr. Hargrave's fate. According to county records, this arrangement allowed local officials to sidestep the complexities that would arise from trying to compel communication with the cave's inhabitants while yet satisfying federal standards. Sealing the main entrance, however, proved less, more successful than expected. In a matter of months, county employees found that the barriers had been meticulously taken down and put back up several times, indicating that the cave's occupants had the equipment and know-how required to preserve access while appearing to adhere to official regulations. Authorities came to the conclusion that permanent closure was not logistically possible after more attempts to block the entry had similar outcomes. By 1966, a loose consensus had formed between the residents of the cave and the county officials. Law enforcement would not actively investigate the underground community as long as there were no occurrences that needed government action. Since there were no reports of issues or disputes in the years that followed, it seemed like everyone was happy with this arrangement. Although the cave's entrance was still formally sealed, the locals knew that this was only a symbolic action. Up until 1967, Mrs. Fenwick kept running her boarding home, when she was compelled to sell the property due to age and deteriorating health. Other letters she had received from Dr. Hargrave in the initial months after his disappearance were found among her personal belongings after her death. She was reassured by these messages, which were sent by unidentified means and scribbled on improvised paper, that he was safe and healthy, but that he was unable to return to his previous life because of what he described as permanent obligations to more important tasks. The correspondence addressed to Mrs. As Dr. Hargrave went from being a university researcher to a permanent cave dweller, Fenwick shed light on his mental state. He described finding a group of people who had all decided to completely distance themselves from mainstream culture for personal reasons. He maintained that they were not disturbed people running away from personal issues, but rather people who had carefully and sensibly chosen to follow what they saw to be a more genuine way of living. Dr. Hargraves's descriptions in these letters indicate that the cave community lived by values that valued individual liberty, intellectual curiosity, and environmental sustainability over the material accumulation and social conformity he had come to associate with surface society. Members offered their unique expertise to the group's well-being while retaining total autonomy to follow their own hobbies and academic pursuits. The system of caves offered the social seclusion and physical refuge required for what he defined as true human development. At his last letter to Mrs. Fenwick, written at the beginning of 1967, Dr. Hargrave thanked her for her support throughout his time of transition and assured her that his decision had been completely satisfactory. In ways that his time at university had never offered, he characterized his existence underground as both personally and intellectually rewarding. Above all, he added, he had learned that the inquiries that had motivated him to pursue academic studies may be done more successfully in a setting free from social expectations and institutional restrictions. The scientific community's reaction to Dr. Hargrave's disappearance changed over time, moving from worry to perplexity to finally acknowledging that a reputable researcher had willingly given up his work for unknown reasons. His published works were still referenced in geological literature, and his methods for mapping caves were used by scientists operating in comparable settings. However, as succeeding generations of scientists conducted their own study without being aware of his peculiar fate, his name progressively disappeared from active scholarly discussion. Pocahontas County inhabitants have a longer-lasting local recall of Dr. Hargrave and the Whispering Hollow Cave incident. Tales of the scientist who vanished into the mountain were passed down, but over time, these tales began to resemble local mythology more than, as opposed to historical truth. Younger generations were exposed to condensed versions that highlighted the case's enigmatic elements while leaving out the documented evidence that had proven its veracity. When the Smithsonian Institution reviewed Dr. E. Hargrave's research contributions in 1968, his disappearance was deemed to be a closed case that didn't need to be looked into further. His study materials were recognized as valuable, and his work on Appalachian cave systems was moved to permanent archives so that future researchers may access them. His disappearance was viewed by the official position as an unfortunate accident that had kept him from finishing his investigations and disseminating his results. Although locals periodically reported seeing lights traveling around the mountain during the winter, the cave entrance remained formally blocked into the late 1960s. Although these findings were noted in county records, no official reaction because officials had acknowledged that the inhabitants of the cave systems did not represent a threat to those on the surface. Both groups were able to live together without conflict or unwelcome interaction, thanks to the long-lasting informal arrangement that had emerged. A group of scholars from West Virginia University conducted the final known attempt to explore Whispering Hollow Cave in 1969. This team, operating under federal archaeological licenses, aimed to record the cultural alterations made to the cave and produce an extensive diagram of the entire system. Their efforts were put on hold, nevertheless, when it became evident that the cave was still inhabited and that the people living within did not want their community to be photographed by outsiders. According to the university experts, they discovered significant alterations to the cave system that went well beyond what Dr. Hargrave had recorded. These included water management infrastructure, advanced ventilation systems, and residential areas that could hold a large populace. Most astonishingly, they found indications of continuous construction and growth, indicating that the subterranean civilization was expanding and developing its environmental changes. Since the residents of the cave system had expressed a strong wish to be left alone, the researchers came to the conclusion that their participation would be necessary for any study of the system. As part of regular administrative processes, federal agencies reviewed the Dr. Hargrave case on occasion throughout the 1960s, but no fresh inquiry was never started. Ultimately, the case was categorized as a voluntary absence by an adult who had left behind unambiguous proof of his mental capacity and objectives. This classification acknowledged that some issues regarding his destiny would always remain unanswered while yet meeting legal standards. A memorandum, dated December 1969, the last official record pertaining to Dr. Hargrave's case, stated that his university employment had been formally terminated owing to prolonged absence and that his personal. The National Archives had received the effects. The report stated that although Dr. Hargrave's study had provided important insights into Appalachian cave systems, his unorthodox techniques and eventual disappearance precluded a thorough assessment of his scientific accomplishments. By the end of the decade, Dr. Alexander Hargrave had successfully moved from being a missing person to a historical footnote, remembered mostly by a few locals, and preserved in official records that would, seldom consulted by researchers in the future. His transition from a renowned university scientist to a self-selected caveman exemplified a lifestyle decision that went against accepted notions of social and professional duty, making it challenging to classify his case using standard bureaucratic frameworks. Long into the 1970s, evidence of living in the Whispering Hollow cave system persisted, although direct communication between surface and subterranean cultures becoming less common. Locals were adept at spotting the telltale signs of continued activity inside the mountain. However, these insights were not regarded as issues needing official attention, but rather as private information. The unofficial agreement that had been established in the 1960s turned out to be astonishingly solid, enabling both groups to continue living their desired lives free from one another's interference. University libraries continued to carry Dr. Hargrave's scholarly works, give academics studying Appalachian geology and cave systems important information. His contributions to speleological knowledge outlived his physical presence in the academic community since other scientists embraced his mapping and recording approaches. But his most important finding, that there was a functional underground society, was never recorded in any official scientific publication. The case files pertaining to the disappearance of Dr. Hargrave were moved to regional archives in 1970, where they were included in Pocahontas County's historical records. Despite providing a thorough record of the official response to his disappearance, these documents, which included sheriff's reports, summaries of federal investigations, and correspondence from multiple agencies, provided little information about his personal reasons or eventual destiny. These files were upsetting to researchers who later looked at them, since they were comprehensive but ultimately inconclusive about the case's issues. Among locals, especially those whose families had been in the area for several generations, the tale of Dr. Hargrave was incorporated into the larger body of mountain folklore that retained information about the region's obscure past. These unofficial customs preserved awareness of the unique qualities of the cave system, while honoring the apparent wish of its occupants to remain unaffected by outside interest or meddling. The scientific apparatus, it was eventually donated to West Virginia University's Geology Department, where students studying speleological procedures used what Hargrave had left in his boarding house room, This contribution included his own books and papers, which gave future scholars access to his early research on Appalachian cave systems without disclosing why he chose to forego this work in favor of living underground permanently. The sporting house owned by Mrs. Fenwick was transformed into a residential home upon her passing. However, the new owners uncovered more information about the doctor's stay at Hardgraves that had been missed in the initial investigation. These relics, which included notes about local folklore and sketches of cave formations, were given to the County Historical Society along with other items that documented the region's geological and cultural legacy. But the most important things Mrs. Fenwick's letters from Dr. End, our cemetery that detailed his underground life, were never revealed to the public, eventually vanished from the annals of history. Except for those who had a direct personal connection to the events, the Whispering Hollow Cave case was progressively forgotten as the 1970s went on. The county officials who had participated in the first investigation either retired or relocated, taking their in-depth familiarity with the matter with them. After being educated on the cave's restricted status, new law enforcement officers were not provided with sufficient background information regarding the rationale behind the restrictions, which resulted in a progressive loss of institutional memory about the existence of the underground community. Official records showed that the cave entrance was still closed, but seasoned outdoor enthusiasts in the area knew that these restrictions were kept in place more for administrative reasons than as actual hurdles to entry. The subterranean community seems to have devised efficient strategies for preserving their seclusion while meeting the requirement to assure surface authorities that the proper security measures were in place. Physician. As the academic community shifted to new issues and staff changes erased personal recollection of Hargrave's work, his university colleagues finally ceased asking about his fate. Other scientists occasionally cited his work. However, these allusions regarded him as a historical person whose contributions date back to a previous period of spiritual investigation. Academic circles never took into account the idea that he might still be alive and carrying his study underground, when it was practically unthinkable to voluntarily give up one's employment and credentials. The Whispering Hollow Cave case had reached a stable equilibrium by the middle of the 1970s. Satisfying all sides yet preserving the uncertainties that prevented a full resolution. The discovery of an underground colony and the disappearance of Dr. Hargra were both recorded in official documents, but neither gave any up-to-date information on their present state. Locals continued to recognize the cave system's uniqueness, traits while honoring its residents' apparent need to evade unwelcome attention. While avoiding active intervention in a scenario that seemed to require none, federal and state agencies continued to have nominal supervision obligations. It was challenging to comprehend Dr. Lysander Hargrave's situation within traditional frameworks of mental health because his transition from university researcher to permanent cave inhabitant indicated a type of life decision that fell outside regular categories of human conduct. Health, social duty, and professional accountability. It seems that he made this choice deliberately and logically. However, it required giving up relationships and commitments that most people would view as essential to one's sense of self and social duty. According to the records from Dr. Hargra's transition phase that have remained, he may have found something in Whispering Hollow Cave that altered his conception of what constituted human existence and how it may be structured. Meaningful labor. In his works, he characterized this revelation as a development toward what he saw as a more genuine kind of human existence rather than as a rejection of civilization. It was impossible to tell from the evidence at hand whether this was a sign of true insight or a slow decline in psychological health. Researchers who discovered the cave system's existence were still fascinated by it, but practical and moral issues hindered a thorough examination of its cultural changes or present occupants. The technological difficulties of exploring caves, the obvious desire for seclusion of the underground population, and the legal issues of researching individuals who had made the decision to disengage from traditional social systems made a thorough inquiry practically difficult. Dr. Hargrave's case became a historical curiosity as the decade went on, occasionally brought up in conversations about strange disappearances or underground colonies, but never the focus of new research or analysis. The questions about his destiny were still as enticing as ever, but as time had gone on, the likelihood of finding answers had decreased, and the pragmatic justifications for refraining from greater investigation had solidified. Pocahontas County locals established their own relationship with the mystery, viewing the system of whispering hollow caves as a part of their local environment that called for caution and respect, but not animosity or fear. Youngsters growing up in the locals came to view the shut cave opening as a landmark, connected to fascinating tales of the scientist who vanished into the mountain. However, these narratives were viewed as historical amusement rather than pressing issues that needed immediate attention. Surface and subterranean communities' informal understanding, which had grown during the 1960s, remained functional, indicating that both groups had figured out how to meet each other's needs and preferences without firm agreement or direct negotiation. This arrangement offered a novel way to address the problem of balancing the needs of those who have chosen total disengagement from traditional social institutions with those of mainstream society. Regardless of concerns regarding his personal destiny, Dr. Hargrave's contributions to speleological knowledge would be accessible to future researchers thanks to his published studies and archival materials which preserved his scientific legacy. His methods for mapping. Its recording techniques continue to have an impact on cave exploration across the Appalachian region, offering enduring value that went beyond the enigmas surrounding his disappearance. Researchers studying the social and cultural history of the area would eventually be able to access the case files that documented the official investigation into Dr. Hargrave's disappearance since they were stored in archives as part of the permanent historical record. These records offer a thorough understanding of how municipal, state, and federal authorities had addressed a unique circumstance involving deliberate disengagement from mainstream society, providing important insights into community interactions and governmental processes in the 1960s. Dr. Losander Hargrave's transition from missing person to historical figure was virtually finished by the end of the 1970s. His name was sporadically mentioned in scholarly works and local histories, but always in relation to historical occurrences rather than current issues. The inquiries surrounding his fate had become permanently uncertain, acknowledged, but no longer actively investigated by any government agency or educational establishment. Throughout the decade, the system of whispering hollow caves remained essentially the same. Technically restricted, officially sealed, and practically accessible to those who knew enough and were motivated enough to work out the unwritten rules that controlled its use. Subtle indications of continued activity in the underground community persisted, but these observations were dismissed as private information as opposed to topics needing public discussion or official attention. Questions about social duty, individual liberty, and the boundaries of traditional life choices, as well as the wider ramifications of Dr. Hargrave's case, were still pertinent today. However, his particular circumstance had progressed from active consideration to historical example. His choice to forego a career in academia and surface society in favor of conducting research underground persisted in challenging the norm. Comprehension of logical conduct. However, this problem had evolved over time from an urgent issue to a philosophical one. The scientific community had long since assimilated the useful insights from